I hadn't been back to my mother's new house since she married Patrick, and even as my car rolled up the long driveway, the whole place felt like unfamiliar territory. It was all white siding and clean lines, the kind of suburban perfection that looked like it belonged in a magazine spread. My mother had told me over the phone that Patrick's son, Mason, would be there for the weekend, too. We'd met once briefly at their wedding 2 years ago. I remembered him as polite, but distant, someone who shook my hand firmly and then disappeared into the crowd. When I stepped out of the car, the front door swung open, and there he was, taller than I remembered, broader, with a presence that somehow filled the doorway. He smiled, the kind of easy practice smile that made you feel like you belonged even when you didn't. Before I could say anything, Mason stepped forward and wrapped his arms around me. It wasn't the kind of quick, casual hug you give out of politeness. It lingered. His chest pressed against mine, his grip firm and unhurried, and for a brief second, I forgot this was my stepbrother, forgot that we were practically strangers. When he finally pulled back, his eyes held mine for a fraction longer than necessary, something unreadable flickering there before he stepped aside to let me in. My mother appeared in the hallway, arms open and voice warm as ever. The three of us exchanged the usual greetings, and Mason disappeared toward the kitchen. I followed the sound of clinking glasses to find him pouring drinks, iced tea for himself, lemonade for me without asking. I raised an eyebrow. Remembered from the wedding, he said with a shrug. You didn't touch the tea then either. It was a small detail, but it unsettled me. How had he remembered something so minor from a night filled with 100 faces and conversations? The evening unfolded in a haze of family chatter. Patrick grilled steaks on the back deck, while my mother fussed over salad dressing, and Mason kept finding small ways to draw me into conversation, asking about my work, my apartment, the places I'd been lately. He laughed easily, and I found myself responding in kind, though part of me felt guilty for enjoying the attention. Grant, my boyfriend of 3 years, had been distant for months now, his career swallowing up our evenings and weekends. We'd argued just last week about how little time we spend together. I told myself Mason's warmth was just filling that temporary void, nothing more. After dinner, we all settled in the living room. The TV played a muted baseball game while conversation shifted from sports to travel plans. I noticed Mason sitting across from me, one ankle resting on his knee, his gaze flickering toward me every so often. It wasn't overt enough for anyone else to notice, but I felt it each time, like a tap on the shoulder no one else could see. When the night wound down, my mother showed me to the guest room, bright, neat, and smelling faintly of lavender. I unpacked my bag slowly, the sounds of muffled conversation fading as the others retreated to their rooms. I told myself I was tired, that I'd fall asleep easily after the long drive. But as I lay in bed, my mind replayed the moment on the porch. Mason's arms around me. The pause. That slight, deliberate delay before he let go. I tried to think of it as nothing, just a friendly gesture. But the truth was, I hadn't wanted him to let go. Not right away. And that truth pressed against my ribs in the quiet, making it impossible to drift off. The next thing I knew, there was a faint knock on my door. I froze, heart kicking up in my chest. It was late, too late, for casual conversation. Hey, Mason's voice came through low and calm. Just wanted to see if you needed anything before I head to bed. I swallowed, unsure why my throat felt dry. No, I'm good. Thanks. There was a pause on the other side of the door, a moment, so still I could hear the faint hum of the hallway light. Then his footsteps retreated, slow and unhurried, and I was left staring at the ceiling. The room felt warmer somehow, the air thicker. I turned onto my side and pulled the blanket tighter around me, but the image of Mason, his smile, the way his eyes seemed to catch on mine, refused to fade. It was ridiculous. We were family now, at least on paper. And yet, as I closed my eyes, I realized something I wasn't ready to admit out loud. The hug hadn't felt like family at all. The morning light filtered through the blinds in pale strips, cutting across the guest room in quiet lines. I'd slept restlessly, my dreams a blur of faces and half-formed conversations that left me feeling oddly unsteady. When I finally made my way downstairs, Mason was already in the kitchen, leaning casually against the counter, a mug in hand. "Morning," he said, his voice still edged with sleep. His hair was slightly messy, and there was something disarming about seeing him without the polished ease he'd worn last night. "Morning," I replied, reaching for a glass of water. "Dad's taking your mom into town," he added. "Something about picking up fresh bread from that place she loves. Won't be back for a while." The way he said it was casual, but it landed in my chest with a strange weight. I was halfway through my glass when Mason tilted his head toward the back door. "Come give me a hand in the garage. I'm fixing up something, and I could use an extra set of hands." The garage smelled faintly of oil and sawdust, sunlight spilling in through a side window. Mason was working on an old wooden chair, its legs spread out on the floor, like a patient mid-surgery. "Hold this steady," he said, crouching down beside me. Our shoulders brushed, and I caught a hint of his cologne. Subtle, warm, almost distracting. We worked quietly at first, the only sounds the scrape of sandpaper and the occasional clink of a tool, but then Mason glanced sideways at me. "So, how are things with Grant?" I hesitated, my hands tightening on the chair leg. "Fine," I said, though the word fell hollow in my mouth. He gave a small, knowing smile. "That's not exactly convincing." I didn't answer. Part of me wanted to defend my relationship, to explain that work stress and late nights didn't mean Grant cared any less. But another part of me, the quieter, more honest part, knew the gap between us had been widening for months. Mason didn't push. Instead, he told me about a breakup he'd gone through last year, how he'd stayed too long with someone who didn't make him feel seen. "It's strange," he said, eyes fixed on the chair. "You can be in the same room with someone and still feel invisible." The words slid under my skin, unsettling in their accuracy. When the chair was finished, Mason dusted off his hands and nodded toward the backyard. "Walk." We stepped into the mild morning air, the grass still damp beneath our shoes. The neighborhood was quiet, only the occasional sound of a car in the distance. Mason asked about my work, my hobbies, the things that made me feel alive. I'd realized with a start that no one had asked me that in a long time. "You're too serious," he teased at one point, grinning. "Am I?" "Yeah, like you're always carrying something heavy around. You should let it go once in a while." I laughed, surprised at how easy it was. The sound felt strange in my own ears, as though it belonged to someone lighter, freer. We stopped by the edge of the yard, where the fence lined up with a stand of trees. The sunlight caught on Mason's face, softening his features. He reached out, briefly resting a hand on my shoulder. It was a small gesture, but the warmth of it lingered long after he let go. Back at the house, I tried to busy myself in the kitchen, slicing fruit for breakfast. I was rinsing blueberries in the sink when I sensed someone behind me. I turned to find Mason there, shirtless, holding a carton of milk. The muscles in his arms shifted as he poured it into his glass, and I forced my gaze away, focusing instead on the fruit. "Hungry?" he asked, nodding at the plate. "Yeah," I said, my voice a little too quiet. He leaned against the counter, watching me. "You deserve someone who sees you, Caleb. Don't forget that." The words landed like a stone dropped into deep water, rippling outward in ways I couldn't stop. Later, when my mother and Patrick returned, the house filled with chatter again. But I felt like I was moving through it all from a distance. Mason stayed near, but didn't speak much, and I caught myself wondering if I'd imagined the weight behind his earlier words. That night, as I lay in bed, I replayed the day, the quiet garage, the walk, the unexpected way he'd made me laugh. It felt dangerous, this growing awareness of him. Dangerous because it wasn't supposed to be there, and because a part of me was already starting to want more. And yet I didn't push it away. Rain began before noon, the kind that blurred the edges of the world outside the windows and drummed steadily on the roof. The air felt cooler, the house quieter. Most of the family had gone into town for errands, but I'd chosen to stay back. Mason had, too. I found him at the dining table, spreading a deck of cards between his hands. Want to play?" he asked, tilting his head toward the chair opposite him. I sat, the chair legs scraping lightly against the hardwood. He dealt us each a pile, the corners of the cards slightly worn. We started with a game of rummy, but soon the rules bent to conversation. He asked about the places I'd traveled, the things I wished I could do if work and life didn't constantly get in the way. I asked about his own dreams, the ones he kept tucked away, where no one else could reach. His answers were honest, sometimes unexpectedly raw. "You ever feel like you're just waiting for your life to start?" he said at one point, shuffling the deck without looking at it. I thought about Grant, about the way I kept telling myself things would get better if I just waited long enough. "Yeah," I said quietly. "I do." The rain deepened outside, pattering against the glass like restless fingers. We played until the power flickered, the lights dimming for a breath before cutting out entirely. Mason laughed softly. "Guess we're going old school." I followed him into the kitchen, where he found candles in a drawer, lighting one with a flick of a lighter. The flame painted his features in warm gold, the shadows deepening around his eyes. He handed me a candle and stood close, his arm brushing mine in the narrow space. He said, his voice quieter now. "I remember the first time I saw you. At the wedding. You were sitting alone on the back patio. I wanted to talk to you, but he shrugged. Didn't seem like the right time. Something inside me shifted at that." "Why?" He met my gaze. "Because even then, you felt different. Like you were somewhere else in your head." The candlelight flickered between us, and for a long moment, neither of us moved. I could hear my own breathing, feel the closeness of him in the cool air. Back in the dining room, the rain muffled the silence. Mason placed his candle on the table, and I did the same. We stood there for a moment, just looking at each other. Then he stepped forward. The hug came without warning. Not like the first one, not like the playful gestures of the day before. This one was slower, deliberate. His arms wrapped around me, firm and certain, and I felt his breath warm against the side of my neck. I didn't move. My own arms lifted, almost on instinct, holding him back. The seconds stretched, heavy with meaning neither of us dared to name. My chest pressed to his, the quiet thud of his heartbeat syncing faintly with mine. I didn't know how long we stood like that. I only knew that when the sound of footsteps creaked faintly from somewhere upstairs, we pulled apart instantly as though burned. He cleared his throat, stepping back toward the table, pretending to busy himself with the cards again. I picked up my candle, my hands unsteady, my mind scrambling to stitch together some sense of normalcy. The lights came back on a few minutes later, but it didn't feel like the room had truly brightened. We didn't speak about the hug. Not then, not for the rest of the afternoon. But every glance we exchanged carried the weight of it, like a secret lodged too deep to remove. That evening, with the rain still tapping softly outside, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling. My thoughts kept looping back to that moment, the way he'd held me like he didn't want to let go, and the truth I couldn't ignore anymore. I hadn't wanted him to let go either, and that terrified me more than I was ready to admit. The rain had stopped by morning, leaving the air cool and clean. Sunlight spilled across the kitchen floor, bright and sharp, as though it was trying to erase the heaviness of the night before. I sat at the table with a cup of coffee, hands wrapped around the mug, staring at nothing in particular. My phone buzzed. A message from Grant. "Sorry I've been so busy. I miss you. Let's plan something soon." I stared at the words, unsure whether they made me feel relieved or hollow. After everything that had happened, or nearly happened, with Mason, I couldn't tell if this was a lifeline or a reminder of a commitment I wasn't sure I could fully keep. Mason entered the kitchen, quietly, his hair still damp from a shower. "Morning," he said, his tone polite, almost distant. "Morning," I echoed. He poured himself coffee, not looking at me right away. For a few moments, the only sound was the soft clink of his spoon against the mug. Eventually, he leaned against the counter, arms crossed. "About yesterday," he trailed off, searching for words. "I didn't mean to make things complicated for you." "It's already complicated," I said before I could stop myself. He nodded, as though he'd expected that answer. I don't want to be the reason something breaks in your life. But he stopped again, running a hand over his jaw. I also can't pretend I didn't feel what I felt. The honesty in his voice was almost too much. I set my mug down, my fingers restless against the table. Neither can I. We stood in that uneasy truth for a long moment. Outside, a bird called somewhere in the trees, its sound clear and simple in contrast to the mess between us. Later that afternoon, as I was loading my bag into my car, Mason came out to the porch. The sun was low, throwing long shadows across the driveway. My mother and Patrick were inside, giving us this small pocket of privacy without even realizing it. I'm not going to pretend I have the right words. Mason said, I just know that when I hugged you, it wasn't out of obligation. And it wasn't just because you're family now. It was because I wanted to. I swallowed hard, the weight of that admission settling deep, and I didn't stop you because I wanted it too. There it was, the thing neither of us had dared to say out loud until now. We didn't move closer. We didn't touch. We just stood there, both knowing that crossing that line again would change everything in ways we couldn't undo. I don't know where you and Grant stand, Mason said, but you deserve more than waiting around hoping someone will notice you again. I almost told him that he wasn't making it easier to go back. But instead I said, and you deserve someone who doesn't have to keep you a secret. For a moment I thought he might step down from the porch, close the space between us. Instead, he gave a faint smile, one that felt like both a promise and a goodbye. I walked toward the driver's side door, my bag slung over my shoulder. Just as I was about to get in, he called my name. When I turned, he was standing there with that same look he'd worn the first time I arrived, steady, searching. He came down the steps, closing the distance in slow, measured strides. He didn't say anything when he reached me. He just pulled me into one last hug. It was exactly like the first one, long, unhurried, the world outside of it disappearing. Only now it was heavier, not with guilt, but with the knowledge that this was the last time. When we let go, neither of us looked away right away. Then, with a quiet exhale, Mason stepped back. Take care of yourself, Caleb, he said. I got into the car, the engine rumbling to life, and drove away without looking in the mirror. As the house faded from view, I realized I would carry that hug with me for a long time, not because of what it meant we could have had, but because of what it reminded me about myself. That sometimes the most powerful moments aren't the ones that change your life, they're the ones that make you see it more clearly. And that clarity, for better or worse, was something I wasn't ready to let go of.